Hello, my name is Michael Smook. Today is November 2nd, it's a Friday, and we're in the year 2018. I'm speaking to you from my home in Forest Hills, New York. Forest Hills is in Queens County, which is an outer borough of the city of New York. Today's talk, it's episode 27, and it's entitled, What's Working? That's with a question mark. The reason I decided to give this title today stemmed from the fact it's not just during the Trump administration over the last 22 months. From time to time, people will say to me, it's just not happening. In Washington, in Albany, in the city of New York, the federal, the state, and the city capitals, it's not happening. So I want to speak to you about what's working. And it's a three-parter. So in 2 to 3 weeks, we'll be talking about the good. That's part 3. It's entitled, and we're going to be talking about what's working. And what's working is that local cities and states, and we're going to talk about how nonprofits, private organizations, and city and state government are pooling their resources, their talents, their energies together, and they're getting things done. And that's because what they're doing is they're putting their politics aside, they're meeting together and working on overlapping issues related to economics and social welfare. And people are not so concerned with getting political credit, but they're focusing on civic mindedness. So that's what we'll talk about in 2 to 3 weeks, and that's part 3, the good. In 7 to 10 days, what we'll be talking about is the bad, and that'll be part 2. Now that's a negative saying the bad, but it's really important to talk about this. Over the last 2 generations, a generation is 20 to 25 years. So doing the math, we're talking about over 40 to 50 years, the middle class has grown weaker. And there are many reasons for this. At the same time, the country is wealthier, and that's in particular the top 10% in terms of income and resources, assets that are wealthier, that make the country overall wealthier, but the middle class is struggling. Whether you're one head of household or 2 heads, whether you have 1, 2, or more children, everybody's struggling from paycheck to paycheck to put a roof over their heads, food in their stomach, clothes on their backs, save some money for your kids' college, save money for retirement. And it's impossible to wrap your head around keeping up with your bills and saving money and keeping the family moving. So we're going to talk about the bad. We're going to talk about how the middle class is weaker. We're going to talk about why that happened. And we'll also be, I'm going to be going through my YouTube talks and suggestions that I've made previously to energize the economy, strengthen the middle class, as well as we're going to talk about how to expand the middle class to reach out to low-income people. We've had 10 years of prosperity after a severe recession, and poor people are still poor. And it's a national security issue. Poor people need to be brought into the mainstream. If they have equity in the system, this country will be a lot healthier. So that's 7 to 10 days. We'll talk about part 2. Today, it's part 1. It's called The Ugly. The ugly is an even harsher, negative, more negative sounding title than the bad. But it's important that we talk about ugly because of the coarseness of the dialogue in this country. It's emanating from Washington out through the nation, and at times from the heartland to state and the nation's capital as well. So we're all in this together, and we all have work to do. So that's why we're talking about the ugly. And there are many topics we could talk about, but we're going to just focus in on one. Before I get into that, let me back up for just a second and tell you, how did I decide to name this topic part 1 today of episode 27? How did I decide to call this the ugly? And the story sort of goes like this. President Trump was inaugurated on January 17th, 2017. And he's the 45th president of the United States. And I walked into the office of a friend of mine, a coworker, and he's an affable fellow, he's very likable, and he's very even-tempered. And he said to me something that startled me words like flabbergasted and speechless when he told me what I'm going to tell you now. What he told me, it was something. He said to me, he said, let me tell you, let me make clear about this, Michael. My wife and I will not socialize with people who voted for Donald Trump and who are enthusiastic supporters of him. We will not socialize with them at all. And at first I didn't know what to say. And then I said to my friend, I said, I have a thought or two I'd like to share with you. Do you want to hear what I have to say? And my friend said, go ahead. And I said, there are two kind of people that are challenges for me. Coworkers, friends, family, lots of people annoy me. And yet I still find a way to get along with people. I work with them, I work around them, I work through them, I work to keep relationships up with people. And then there are people, I happen to have a lot of friends who voted for Donald Trump, and I know some of the reasons why they did. And I understand the logic behind why they did what they did. It was an adult decision, and I respect their right, even though I may disagree with them. I'll defend their right to do it, even though I disagree with them. So my Trump voting and supporting friends, if I understand why they feel the way they feel, but the thing about it is, the way I summarized it all to my friend was, if I had nothing to do with people who annoy me and or people who voted and support Donald Trump, if I had nothing to do with any of these people, I'd be a very lonely person. And I don't recall what the rest of the conversation happened, but I do know that when I think about that, even though it's a reflection of the coarseness and the raw feelings people have in different parts of the ideological divide, I find humor in it as well. And I guess the only reason I find humor in it is that comedy is serious business. And it's good to have a laugh sometimes about these things because we live in interesting times. Now, there are a lot of topics we could talk about in terms of. Oh, let me back up for just a second. I wanted to talk to you about a friend of mine who is a Trump voter and supporter. Usually we get together, we talk about, my wife and I, we get together with this woman and her husband, and we talk about anything but politics. And usually in the course of 2, 3, 4 hours together, maybe they'll ask me one question. And I get to the point in 15, 20, maybe 30 seconds. But lately, over the last 4 to 6 months, my friend, she says to me, I feel something in her voice. There's a anxiousness and a hurt in her voice. And she says to me, Michael, the coarseness of the language, the dialogue, it really bothers me. Is it going to get better? And it's really important that I assuage her concerns. And I just very succinctly, I said, I guarantee it's going to get better. We're going to work this through. And we get together a number of times, same question. So the fact is that I just want, this is my friend, and I may not agree with her politics. She may not agree with mine, but we maintain friendships. My wife and I socialize with people, and we don't take a litmus test on their politics. So anyway, so this is contrasting stories. One friend who's a Trump voter and supporter who's living in a blue state, and it must be very hard except for Staten Island. If you live in the city of New York, 4 of the 5 boroughs are solidly Democrat. So if you say that, even if you don't want to talk politics most of the time, if you casually mention about your support Donald Trump or you're in favor of this policy, it must be, what I imagine what my friend is going through, it must be very difficult for her to have conversations about this sort of stuff. Sometimes she would like to talk about it, and maybe she can't. So that's what I think is going through, and that's what I think she's thinking and she might be feeling. And I wanted to share with you friends and coworkers who have different political points of view and the kind of pain that they might be feeling. And that's why I told these 2 stories. So now let's move on to the coarseness of the conversation, and we need to budget our time. There are quite a few topics we could talk about, and we're not going to talk. We're going to talk about one topic, but only specific aspects of one topic. And we're going to talk briefly about the Kavanaugh hearings and the vote. Brett Kavanaugh was nominated to be a Supreme Court justice, and it was a controversial hearing. And he won. He's now a Supreme Court justice, and he won narrowly 51 to 49. And there are a couple of things that bother me that I want to share with you. And it relates to the toxicity of the kind of conversations that we're having in Washington. Dr. Blasey Ford, she said she was sexually assaulted by Brett Kavanaugh 36 years ago when he was 17 years old and she was 15. Now he's 53 and she's 51. He won a tough vote and he sits on the U.S. Supreme Court. And Dr. Blasey Ford is a researcher and a psychologist and a very bright woman as well. And she belatedly and reluctantly gave testimony. She didn't want to give testimony, and she wanted to keep it private, but it was leaked to the press, and she felt physically threatened, and she had to pay for security and for a while go into hiding. And there are a couple of points I want to make about this whole process because we're budgeting our time. The first thing is Dr. Blasey Ford said that when she was at this house party, she was there and she did some things her parents wouldn't approve of because there were no adults to supervise these teenagers and the kids were drinking beer. And what happened was, I don't know the whole timeline of what happened, and I'm not sure Dr. Blasey Ford went into complete detail because she said that some of her memories are not clear, but some things are extremely clear and they're seared in her memory. What she does remember is that at a certain point, Brett Kavanaugh was on top of her on a bed in a second floor bedroom, and he was trying to pull her clothes off, and she was screaming, and she said he was drunk, and he put his hand over her mouth. And we'll probably never know exactly what happened because there was an FBI investigation, but it was limited in scope. The president made sure it was limited in scope. Otherwise, this could have gone on for weeks or perhaps months. And what happened was she was afraid that she was afraid because she was being sexually assaulted. And then she was afraid when he put his hand over her mouth that she was going to suffocate. And then Brett Kavanaugh's friend, Mark Judge, comes in the room. He jumps on top of both of them, and the boys fell off the side of the bed. And then she ran into the, I don't have the exact timeline, but she ran into a bathroom, locked it, and the boys were laughing as they went down the stairway from the second floor to the first floor. And she was asked by one of the questioners, a U.S. Senator, what do you remember most from this horrific evening? And she said, what I remember most was that the boys were laughing at my expense. And that resonates inside me. And I didn't feel good when I heard it, and I still don't feel good now. So that's one point I wanted to make today. The second point is that President Trump initially said the right things. He said Dr. Blasey Ford gave credible testimony, and I'm looking to see how this nomination process proceeds. And then he quickly endorsed Brett Kavanaugh. He said he believes that Brett Kavanaugh is innocent of all charges made against him, and that he's going to pass and be the next Supreme Court justice. Fine. This is the president's candidate. This is a political process, not a criminal proceeding, and I could understand why the president behaved and said what he said. Fine, that's fine with me. Even though it was disturbing to feel this woman, listen to her pain, and it was very credible and very plausible and convincing to me. Although we'll never know what actually happened that day because the FBI investigation was limited by the president and it wasn't allowed to continue. But so what happened was after the president gave uh, a balanced assessment of what happened during the testimony of Dr. Blasey Ford and at the time Judge Brett Kavanaugh. He's now Justice Brett Kavanaugh. He went to a rally several days later in Mississippi, and he was going through Dr. Blasey Ford's testimony, and he was repeated the same Q&A between Dr. Blasey Ford and his questioners, and he sounded I could feel and I could hear sarcasm, and he was mocking her. And I felt that was terribly unfortunate, even though I understand this is a political fight, it's not a legal fight. But the thing about it is, with the president with sarcasm, and it's a political event. It's almost the equivalent of a high school pep rally, and I see on the video, people with "Making America Great Again," and he's repeating the same punchlines over and over again, and people are laughing, and again they're laughing at Dr. Blasey Ford's expense, and Donald Trump is a performance artist, so maybe that's his political genius, but to me, he crossed the line. And this is why I think he crossed the line. He's the president of the United States, of everyone who voted for him, everybody who voted against him, and everybody who's a citizen who didn't vote at all. He's the president not just of the wealthy people who receive tax cuts that he put through, but they're the middle class people who are struggling, and low income people too. And he's not only head of the government, he's not only the most powerful official in the federal government, he's also head of state. And this job is two important jobs combined in one person. If you look at another country like the United Kingdom, it's broken up between two people. The head of government is Theresa May. She's Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And the head of state is Queen Elizabeth. She's had that job for well over 60 years. And so the jobs are split between two people. So Donald Trump is the face of the United States of America, and I think it's terribly unfortunate that he spoke in the manner that he did. And I have, in previous YouTube talks and in notes to Facebook friends, I usually write a note on Facebook, and I've advocated that President Trump tone down his language and remember that he's president of all the American people. And I think he needs to reach out and find bipartisan policies and actually get things done and draw upon the experiences of other Republican presidents. Dwight Eisenhower with the interstate highway system, Richard Nixon with the EPA and the initiatives to China and Russia, the first President Bush maintaining a steady relationship as the Soviet Empire disintegrated. George Bush made a lot of mistakes, but what he did terribly well is we had great amounts of money sent to Africa for drugs to help people who had HIV and AIDS. So there's a lot of bipartisan, and the No Child Left Behind legislation. So if President Trump looks to Republican policies that were bipartisan in nature, he will be able to partner with Democrats, and I can't say how many more Democrats will then want to vote for him, even if he's successful with that. But he just can't play to his base, and he has to look upon his legacy, and his legacy is what he accomplished. Not just what he's done in the first 2 years. He still has 2 years to build up a legacy and to create a more bipartisan approach. But because of the coarseness of the conversation, I want to quickly talk about, there are two columnists. One leans Republican and conservative, David Brooks of the New York Times. The other one leans Democrat and liberal, E.J. Dionne Jr. of the Washington Post. And they're really very similar in their columns. They're basically saying there's a coarseness, there's a harshness in the conversation. It's toxic. It needs to be policed by a number of stakeholders in the system. There needs to be an environmental movement which removes the toxicity of the conversations that we're having. And Dion says we need to engage in social learning. And what that means is there need to be more conversations between people who don't necessarily agree with the politics. And maybe it's one conversation, maybe it's a number of conversations, maybe it's going to take many years, but we need to lower the volume, and we need to realize that we're all in this together. We're all Americans, and we need to have all American people pulling together, and we need to start to get some things done. And we need to start this partisan bitterness. So what Dion is talking about, what I really liked, he's using the term social learning. And what you do when you're engaged in social learning is, I did some reading about it, and I could break it down in a very simple way. It's you're really putting yourself in the position of your opposition, someone who you might agree with, politically, ideologically, philosophically. There are different words to use for it. And you don't agree with them, but you understand where they're coming from, and they understand where you're coming from. And then over a period of time, you develop respect for people, you respect for their position, and sometimes you find modest changes, compromises. Sometimes it's more substantial, and you'll call them win-win situations. So that's what Dion used the phrase, but Brooks, I think, aligns with that as well. And so it has a calming effect. David Brooks is a sober, solid, centrist, Republican and conservative, and E.J. Dion Jr., who grew up in a Republican home, you could call him whatever you want, Democrat, liberal, but he's very close. These men there's not a great difference between the two. And I feel it's a calming effect listening to both these fellows. And they're very bright, and they're people I draw certain motivation, and it has a calming effect on me reading their columns. And now I want to crosswalk what David Brooks and E.J. Dion Jr. are talking about in their columns, and I want to talk about my philosophy as it relates to my personal life, my professional career, and my politics. And one of the things I've rediscovered in the last 5 years, I've had some health issues, some serious health issues, and fortunately, through the love of my family and friends and good doctors and taking care of myself, I've survived. And it's certainly, I'm much more appreciative of listening. And listening is a much underappreciated communication skill. So the thing about it is this, that listening is a much underappreciated communication skill. And every day I get out of bed and I have to learn the same thing. I have to tell myself, talk less, listen more, ask thoughtful questions. And I have to tell myself that once a day, sometimes 2 or 3 things a day, because it's something that doesn't come easy for me. And I realize that we need to listen to each other more. And the thing about it is, what I also tell myself that reinforces that helps me quite a bit, it stems from the fact that I tell myself in any communication I have with anyone, it's far less important that the person, my counterpart, thinks that I'm smart, funny, or if we disagree on politics or whether the Yankees are going to win the pennant, it's far less important that I'm right. And by opening my mind and listening closely to what the person is saying, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, it unclogs my mind. And since I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone, I become a much smarter person. And I think that's what we need to do more in this country. Look, we have an election coming up. It's a partisan time, and we can have a whole YouTube talk about partisan things that need to be done to change the political discourse. And I'm trying a different approach with you today. If there's one point I want to get across to you today is that we need to talk less, listen more, ask thoughtful questions. And that about summarizes everything I wanted to cover today. This is episode 27. I almost forgot. And it's part 1. In 7 to 10 days, we'll do part 2. And a couple of weeks later, part 3. And that'll be the bad and the good. And so today is November 2nd. It's a Friday. and it's 2018. And it's a Friday, and I'm speaking to you from my home in Forest Hills, New York. Forest Hills is in Queens County, which is an outer borough of the city of New York. So until next time, goodbye and good luck.